The Second Weltkrieg was still in full effect. With Poland gone, one would think that the Internationale was on the brink of losing, but instead, it managed to regain Portugal and launch a full assault from the west. With the war going on for multiple years, different topics were discussed in the news back in the homes of the Americans and Canadians alike. The retirement of Mackenzie King was one of those topics. He led the Liberal Party of Canada since 1919, and first became Prime Minister in 1935. Louis Saint Laurent would replace him as the leader of the Liberals. The Syndicalist offensive was massive indeed. Millions of troops were involved and moved as if their masters gave them the whip. Some believed this was due to them fearing the approach of the main Austrian and Russian armies from the Far East. But for now, those armies would still be occupied around the lands that were formerly known as Poland. Though the nation had officially capitulated, there were still hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers stationed here who either chose to fight to the death or try to get themselves offshore to safety. The offensive for now was going in the favor of the Syndicalists, with them being able to push the enemy back beyond the original borders of previously capitulated Luxembourg. The cleaning up of the Internationale soldiers around Poland took longer than expected, especially as a part of the men still stationed there spearheaded up north to put as much distance between them and the Russians. Though in the center the enemies of syndicalism were being routed, in the south a part of their armies was trying to move west alongside the coast, a tactic that previously worked for both sides. Another attack on former Portugal and Spain commenced. This time it was Greece who saw an opportunity to maintain this offensive, though the ground and soil had been poisoned by all the bombs and artillery shells dropped over the past couple of years. The Russians finally managed to split up the remaining Syndicalists along the coast. Their goal now was to kill as many as they could before they were able to evacuate. A high death toll would surely fall heavy on the Syndicalists not being able to reinforce this quickly. In America, Dwight D. Eisenhower was also not completely focusing on the war overseas. Devastation due to the Second U.S. Civil War still remained, and he set in a new plan in motion to rebuild part of the South to lift spirits domestically, as everyone's sons were fighting in Europe. Austrian's Karl I concentrated everything on air production. Though his units were moving westward, for the time being, he wanted to help out the Kingdom of France, Canada, Romania, and all others who fought the Syndicalists from the skies above. The Second Weltkrieg had cost the lives of almost 30 million soldiers, thereby greatly surpassing the military casualty numbers during the First Weltkrieg. The Romanians gained a lot of traction in the south of France. Though they did not secure a large amount of land in the north, they pretty much secured all of the southern coastline, meaning that reinforcements could arrive from this location once more. By the 25th of July 1944, the last of the remaining Syndicalists were driven into a corner. As they still held the port, some of the men were able to escape in the final hours, while the others all perished to the Russians. Canada was gearing up for another assault. This time, they would pull out all the stops and use the latest technologies to get the overhand. It would take some time, but their next assault would involve around 200,000 troops armed with machine guns, accompanied by the latest modern armor, the Centurion tank. In Portugal, a pincer attack was occurring after seeing the success by Greece and the Romanians on the south side of France. It was a never-ending tug-of-war, but if Portugal and Spain could be conquered and held, it would mean a death sentence to the Syndicalist French. But the Commune's army was still robust and strong, demoralizing their enemies at some fronts, as it seemed impossible for them to strike this hard after having witnessed so much setback in the past. In the final month of 1944, the pincer attack and two forces connected and would now move up north. It was a similar pattern that was witnessed in the offensives concerning mostly Portugal and the US. As 1945 rolled by, the French, as expected, sent forces to battle for Portugal, and since they had conquered it many times, they were expected to do so once more. However, the amount of countries that were involved in this particular offensive were more than before, and they made sure to properly supply their troops once they got on shore to fight against the Syndicalist French. By now, the Romanian attack alongside the coast had been routed by the International, and they were being pushed back eastward, creating more space between the two fronts and giving the Commune time to plan and move their pieces on the chessboard. Halfway through 1945, their counterattack commenced, and initially the expected result was gained, as the combined troops met fierce resistance that they could not cope with. In order to retrieve some pressure from the forces around Spain, the West Indies attempted another naval invasion, and this time used more than 5,000 troops in order to get a good foothold on enemy territory. But even though they used more troops than most countries did during their naval invasions, it was not enough to get a good grip, and in the end, the attempt was all for naught. In India, things were stirring up as well. The Bharatian Commune declared war on the Indian Empire to the south, and chances were likely that the Dominion might get swept in on this during the chaos. At the end of August, an interesting turn of events occurred. To get a better angle on fighting across the entire Central European line, the Commune of France realized that they would have to hold positions in Holland as well. Thus, they declared war on the small country that has already prepared troops at their borders, since neighboring Belgium was in combat long before. Even so, the French poured into their lands with ease alongside the front line with the Entente and hoped to attack the other nations like Russia and Austria via a northern approach. In the first week of October, the Dominion of India got involved with the war of their neighbors. At first glance, they were heading deeper into the Commune territory to get a foothold, but requested America to send reinforcements to at least avoid being pushed back deeper to their side of the border. The Syndicalist French around Spain went down south to break up the Greek and Entente armies to split their supply and reinforcement lines. It looked, once again, like their enemies would lose this landmass that had known war for pretty much a decade. The Syndicalists had a bit more trouble fighting through Holland though. At places like Nijmegen and Eindhoven, they stumbled on fierce resistance as the Dutch were reinforced by Russians and Austrians to the east. In India, the war unfolded in a three-way conflict, as the Indian Empire now also declared war on the Dominion. The Dominion's government now urged the US to speed up the sending of reinforcements. On the west coast of the Kingdom of France, new naval invasions had successfully been pulled off. Both the Americans and the Finnish led the way and were sure to use enough manpower to hold and secure the captured ports. By this time, Canada had mustered over 200,000 new fresh troops that were ready and eager to be sent over to Europe. The news of the successful naval invasions greenlit their departure as they headed into the war. But something very important was happening now in terms of the war. France was showing signs of crackling down. With three main fronts, it could no longer divide all their troops to ensure the invaders be driven out. The Americans were able to move east. As everyone's eyes were fixated on Central Europe, Japan crept ever so closer, stabbing the Russians from behind. In the final days of 1945, the unthinkable had finally been done. The French Syndicalist forces stationed in Spain had been entirely cut off from their main armies and supply lines. They were now on their own. The 200,000 Canadians were on their way to the French shore, but officers told them that they would need to prepare for another battle, the battle that they had been waiting for all these years. In January of 1946, the French Commune managed to create an opening again to Spain, but by doing this, the Americans and Finnish could move even further land inward. By then, France had stationed more men along that line, but it was already too late. The French were broken, and during the next 3 weeks, they suffered loss after loss, until finally the unbelievable message appeared in the newspapers. The Commune of France had capitulated. The leftovers still in Spain were rounded up and killed if they resisted. To most soldiers, the message that the Commune had lost did not arrive until many days later. During the peace conference, France claimed ownership over its old countryside. The Russians and Austrians were at that moment still in control over the former German territory. With the Kingdom of France now having its former territory back, spirits were uplifted all across the Entente. But the Weltkrieg was not over yet, and to many Canadians and exiled British, the main battle of which people spoke over 10 years ago was now at hand. The battle for Britain, the final chapter in this onslaught, was about to begin.